The gunshot echoed across the dusty street, silencing every soul in Broken Ridge as Josephine Reynolds dove behind an overturned wagon. The year was 1879, and the West was still wild enough to make a woman's heart race with fear or anticipation, sometimes both at once. Today, it was decidedly fear as bullets splintered the wood inches from her head. "Miss Reynolds, stay down." A deep voice commanded from somewhere to her right. Josephine didn't need the warning. 6 months working as the town's schoolteacher had taught her that Broken Ridge's peaceful facade could shatter faster than a saloon window on payday. She pressed herself against the dirt, the fine cotton of her dress instantly soaking up dust and grime, but that was the least of her concerns. 3 more shots rang out, followed by the thunder of boots on wooden planks. Then silence, that eerie, waiting silence that felt more dangerous than the gunfire itself. "They're gone, Miss Reynolds," the same voice announced, closer now. "You can come out." Josephine cautiously raised her head to see a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. As he approached, his features became clear. Weathered skin bronzed by years under the unforgiving sun, sharp blue eyes that seemed to catch every movement, and shoulders broad enough to suggest he could carry the weight of the world if needed. "Sheriff Anders Galloway," he introduced himself, extending a hand to help her up. "Apologies for your welcome to our town being so eventful." "I've been here half a year, Sheriff," she replied, accepting his hand and rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster. "And I don't believe we've formally met." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. 6 months. Well, I've been tracking outlaws across 3 territories, just returned yesterday. He studied her with newfound interest. "You're the schoolteacher then?" "I am." She brushed futilely at her ruined dress. "And you've just witnessed my first attempt at breaking up a gunfight." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Not recommended, madam. Next time, perhaps leave the peacekeeping to professionals." "There was a child," she explained, gesturing toward the general store where a mother was clutching her young son tightly. "He was standing right in the open when they drew their guns." Something changed in the sheriff's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight nod of understanding. "Then you did what needed doing, brave if foolhardy." He tipped his hat. "Let me escort you home, Miss Reynolds. Broken Ridge might show its rough edges again before nightfall." Josephine wanted to refuse to prove she could manage herself in this town of hard men and harder circumstances, but wisdom prevailed. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'd appreciate that." They walked in silence for several minutes, the sheriff's spurs jingling with each step, creating a rhythm that somehow calmed Josephine's still racing heart. She studied him from the corner of her eye. The way he walked with one hand always near his holster, how his gaze continually swept the boardwalks and alleyways, missing nothing. "You're not what I expected," she finally said as they approached the small house the town had provided for her use. "And what did you expect, Miss Reynolds?" "Someone older, less." She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Vigilant," he laughed then, a sound that transformed his stern face. "Youth is no virtue in my profession, but it's no sin either." As for vigilance, he cut himself off as his eyes caught movement in the shadows beside her home. In one fluid motion, he positioned himself between her and the potential threat, hand on his holster. "Easy, Sheriff," came a voice as the town doctor emerged from the shadows. "Just checking Miss Reynolds's herbs. She's been kind enough to grow some medicinals I can't easily get shipped in." Josephine stepped forward. "Dr. Peterson, this is Sheriff Galloway, Sheriff, our town doctor." The men nodded to each other, sizing each other up with the caution of wolves from different packs. "Well," the sheriff said after a moment, "it seems you're safely home, Miss Reynolds." "Thank you for your escort," she replied formally, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look, her carefully pinned hair now falling loose around her shoulders, her dress beyond salvation. He tipped his hat again and turned to leave, then paused. "Perhaps you might consider having supper at Maggie's diner tomorrow evening. I should hear about any incidents that occurred during my absence." Before she could respond, Dr. Peterson interjected, "Miss Reynolds dines with me on Thursdays, Sheriff." Professional discussions about the children's health. Something flashed in the sheriff's eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or challenge. "Friday then," he amended, his gaze never leaving Josephine's. She found herself nodding. "Friday would be acceptable, 7 o'clock. "I'll be there at 1:15," he replied, then strode away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the gathering dusk. Dr. Peterson cleared his throat. "The new sheriff seems attentive." "He was simply doing his job," Josephine said, more sharply than intended. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to make myself presentable again." Inside her small house, Josephine lit a lamp and caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. Dust streaked her face, her hair had completely escaped its pins, and her blue dress, her second best, was beyond repair. Yet something in her eyes gave her pause. A brightness, an alertness she hadn't seen in years. She shook her head at her foolishness. One encounter with a handsome sheriff was hardly cause for such reflection. She had come to Broken Ridge for a purpose: to teach, to build something meaningful after everything she'd lost back east. Romance had no place in her carefully constructed new life. Still, as she prepared for bed that night, her thoughts kept returning to those piercing blue eyes and the way Sheriff Galloway had positioned himself between her and danger without hesitation. The next morning brought the usual challenges of teaching 20 children of varying ages and backgrounds in a one-room schoolhouse. Josephine found herself glancing out the window more often than usual, wondering if she might catch sight of the tall sheriff on his rounds. "Miss Reynolds." A small voice pulled her attention back to the classroom. "You're reading the same page twice." Josephine blinked, realizing the child was right. "Thank you, Emma. My mind was wandering." She smiled at the class. "Let's move on to arithmetic, shall we?" The day passed quickly, and soon Josephine was having her regular Thursday dinner with Dr. Peterson, a widower in his 50s who seemed to value their conversations as much as she did. "I noticed the sheriff escorted you home yesterday," he said casually as they finished their meal. "There was an incident in town," she explained. "Gunfire near the general store." The doctor's expression grew serious. "The Blackburn brothers again. They've been causing trouble since the sheriff's been away." "I didn't catch their names," Josephine admitted. "I was more concerned with getting young Timothy Roberts out of harm's way." "Ah, that explains the state of your dress." Dr. Peterson smiled. "Always putting others first, aren't you, Miss Reynolds?" She felt a flush creep into her cheeks. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," he contradicted gently. "You have a good heart, Josephine. It's why the children adore you, and why others in town have taken notice." The implication was clear, and Josephine deliberately changed the subject. "How is Mrs. Garcia's baby doing? Has the fever broken, doctor?" Peterson allowed the diversion, but the knowing look in his eyes suggested the conversation wasn't truly finished. Friday evening arrived with unexpected nervousness. Josephine found herself changing outfits 3 times before settling on a simple but flattering dress of deep green that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. She pinned her auburn hair in a modest style, allowing a few curls to frame her face. "This is not a social engagement," she told her reflection sternly. "It's a discussion about town safety, nothing more." Yet her heart quickened when, at precisely 6:45, a knock sounded at her door. Sheriff Galloway stood on her porch, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and vest. His gun belt was conspicuously absent. "Good evening, Miss Reynolds," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of appreciation as he took in her appearance. "Good evening, Sheriff." She stepped out, locking the door behind her. "Shall we?" Maggie's diner was busy, as it always was on Friday evenings, but a table in the corner seemed to have been reserved for them. Josephine noticed the curious glances and whispered comments as they crossed the room. In a town this size, their dinner would be discussed in every household before midnight. "You seem to have made quite an impression in 6 months, the sheriff observed as they sat down. "Everyone's watching us." "They're watching you," she corrected. "The returning hero who's going to clean up their town." He studied her for a moment. "You don't believe I will?" "I didn't say that." Josephine met his gaze steadily. "But I've seen men like the Blackburn brothers before. They don't respect the law simply because someone wears a badge." "You know them?" There was a sharpness to his question. "Only by reputation." "Dr. Peterson mentioned them yesterday." The sheriff nodded slowly. "3 brothers, mean but not particularly clever. They've been running wild while I was away tracking the Mason gang. Did you catch them?" Josephine asked, genuinely interested. "The Masons, I mean." Something dark passed over his features. "2 of them. The 3rd James Mason is still out there." His hand unconsciously moved to his side, where Josephine guessed a wound might still be healing. Their food arrived, temporarily halting the conversation. As they ate, Sheriff Galloway asked about her background, seeming genuinely interested in her journey from Philadelphia to this dusty frontier town. "Teaching was always my calling," she explained, carefully omitting certain details of her past. "When I saw the advertisement for a teacher here, it seemed providential." "Most Eastern ladies would consider this the back of beyond," he observed. "Not providential at all." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps I'm not most Eastern ladies. That much is obvious." His blue eyes held hers for a moment too long, and Josephine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "And you, Sheriff?" she asked, deflecting attention from herself. "What brought you to law enforcement?" "My father was a lawman," he answered simply. "Taught me that a man stands up for what's right, even when it's not easy, especially when it's not easy." The evening continued pleasantly, their conversation flowing more naturally than Josephine had anticipated. Sheriff Galloway was well-read, despite his frontier profession, and they found common ground discussing authors they both admired. As they walked back to her house under a canopy of stars, Josephine felt a curious reluctance for the evening to end. "Thank you for a lovely dinner," she said as they reached her porch. "The pleasure was mine," he replied, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. "Perhaps we could do this again sometime." Before she could answer, a shout from down the street caught their attention. A young boy was running toward them, panic evident in his face. "Sheriff, come quick. The Blackburns are shooting up the saloon." The transformation was immediate. The gentlemanly dinner companion vanished, replaced by the lawman ready for action. "Stay inside, Miss Reynolds," he ordered, already moving toward the commotion. "Lock your door." She watched him stride away, duty calling him back to danger, and felt a complicated mixture of admiration and fear for his safety. Only after she'd closed and locked her door did Josephine realize she hadn't answered his invitation for another dinner. The next morning, rumors flew through town about the confrontation at the saloon. Sheriff Galloway had arrested 2 of the Blackburn brothers, though the 3rd had escaped. More concerning were the whispers that the fugitive had sworn revenge on the sheriff before fleeing into the night. Josephine was checking her garden when a shadow fell across the plants. She looked up to find Sheriff Galloway watching her, a bruise darkening his left cheekbone but otherwise appearing unharmed. "I heard there was trouble last night," she said, standing and brushing soil from her hands. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he replied, though the tightness around his eyes suggested it had been a close thing. "I came to apologize for our evening being cut short." "There's no need. You were doing your job." He stepped closer, his gaze intent. "I meant what I said about dinner again." "Perhaps when things settle down." "Sheriff Anders," he corrected. "When we're not discussing official business, I'd prefer Anders." The intimacy of using his first name made Josephine pause. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate. Because you're the schoolteacher and I'm the sheriff." A hint of amusement touched his eyes. "This isn't Philadelphia, Miss Reynolds. The rules are different here." "Josephine," she found herself saying, "if I'm to call you Anders." His smile was worth the small concession. "Josephine, then. Would you care to accompany me to the Founders' Day celebration next Saturday? The whole town will be there, so it would be entirely proper." She knew she should refuse. Getting involved with the town sheriff, a man who faced danger daily, was exactly the kind of complication she'd come west to avoid. Yet the words that came out of her mouth surprised her. "I would like that, Anders." The week that followed was both endless and too quick. Josephine found herself looking forward to Saturday with an anticipation that both excited and alarmed her. She'd promised herself no attachments, no vulnerabilities. Her past had taught her the cost of loving too deeply. The Founders' Day celebration transformed Broken Ridge from a dusty frontier town into a place of genuine festivity. Bunting decorated the main street, tables of food lined the square, and a small band played lively tunes that had couples dancing despite the afternoon heat. Anders found her shortly after she arrived, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him in a clean shirt and vest, his badge still pinned to his chest but his manner less official. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. "Thank you." She took it, noting the admiring and curious glances from townspeople. "It seems we're the subject of interest again." "Let them talk," he replied, guiding her toward the refreshment table. "It gives them something to do besides cause trouble." The day passed in a pleasant blur. They shared a meal, watched the children's races, where Josephine cheered proudly for her students, and even joined in a few of the more sedate dances. Anders kept a respectful distance, yet Josephine was acutely aware of the strength in his hands as they held hers during a dance, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the protective way he positioned himself whenever a rowdier element of the celebration threatened to spill over near them. As evening approached, he led her away from the crowd toward a quiet spot near the church where they could still hear the music but have some privacy. "I haven't enjoyed myself this much in years," he admitted, leaning against a tree trunk. "Thank you for coming with me today." "I've had a wonderful time," she replied honestly. "You're different when you're not being the sheriff." "Not so different," he said. "Just less burdened, perhaps. It must be difficult carrying the responsibility for everyone's safety." He shrugged slightly. "It's the job I chose. But yes, there are times I wish I could set it aside just for a while." The vulnerability in his admission touched something in Josephine. "Is that why you asked me to accompany you today, to forget being the sheriff for a few hours?" Anders straightened, turning to face her fully. "No, Josephine. I asked you because from the moment I saw you diving to protect that child, I wanted to know you better. The fact that you make me forget my burdens is an unexpected gift, not my purpose." His sincerity was unmistakable, and Josephine felt walls she'd carefully constructed beginning to crumble. Before she could respond, a movement in the shadows behind Anders caught her attention. "Anders," she cried in warning, but it was too late. A figure emerged from the darkness, gun already drawn. "Thought you'd be too busy courtin' to watch your back, Sheriff," snarled a voice Josephine didn't recognize. Anders moved swiftly, pushing Josephine behind him while reaching for his own weapon. "Blackburn," he acknowledged calmly, "didn't think you'd be foolish enough to return." "Not leaving without my brothers," the man growled. "And maybe settling a score with you." Time seemed to slow. Josephine saw Blackburn's finger tightening on the trigger, saw Anders drawing his weapon with practiced speed, knew that one or both men might die in the next heartbeat. Without conscious thought, she grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and swung it with all her strength at Blackburn's legs. The unexpected attack threw off his aim, his shot going wild as he stumbled. Anders didn't hesitate, closing the distance and disarming the outlaw with efficient, brutal movements. Within seconds, Blackburn was face down in the dirt, Anders's knee in his back as he secured the man's hands. "Are you hurt?" Anders asked Josephine, his voice tight with concern even as he maintained control of his prisoner. "No," she managed, though her hands shook violently. "I'm fine." The commotion had drawn attention, and soon several townsmen arrived to help escort Blackburn to the jail. Only when the outlaw was securely locked away did Anders return to Josephine, who hadn't moved from the spot near the church. "That was incredibly brave," he said, taking her trembling hands in his, "and incredibly foolish. He could have killed you." "He was going to shoot you," she replied simply. "I couldn't let that happen." Anders studied her face intently, then gently pulled her into his arms. Josephine stiffened momentarily before allowing herself to relax against his solid strength. "You've faced danger before," he said quietly, not a question but an observation. She nodded against his chest, not trusting her voice. "One day I hope you'll tell me about it," he continued, his hand making soothing circles on her back. "But not tonight. Tonight let me take you home." The next few weeks brought changes to Broken Ridge and to Josephine's carefully ordered life. Anders became a regular visitor to her small house, sometimes bringing flowers or a book he thought she might enjoy, other times simply stopping by to ensure she was safe. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Though Josephine still kept certain aspects of her past carefully guarded, summer gave way to autumn, the prairie grasses turning golden under the relentless sun. School continued, and Josephine found her students increasingly curious about her friendship with the sheriff. "Are you going to marry Sheriff Galloway, Miss Reynolds?" little Emma asked one day, causing the entire class to erupt in giggles. "That's not an appropriate question, Emma," Josephine replied, fighting a blush. "Now, back to your geography lesson." The truth was, Josephine herself didn't know where their relationship was heading. Anders had been nothing but respectful, their physical contact limited to brief touches and one memorable kiss on her hand after a particularly pleasant evening. Yet she felt the growing tension between them, the unspoken possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. It was a crisp October evening when everything changed. Anders had invited her for a ride to a nearby ridge where the sunset views were particularly spectacular. They sat side by side on a blanket he'd brought, watching the sky transform into a canvas of oranges, pinks, and purples. "I could get used to this," Anders said softly, his shoulder barely touching hers. "Peaceful evenings, beautiful views." He turned to look at her. "Beautiful company." Josephine felt her heart quicken. "It is lovely here." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." He shifted to face her more directly. "Josephine, I've tried to be patient, to give you time, but I need to know if there's any chance for us, for something more than friendship." The moment she'd both anticipated and dreaded had arrived. "Anders, it's complicated." "Life is complicated," he said. "Doesn't mean we stop living it. You don't understand." She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. "There are things about me, about my past, that might change how you see me." "Try me," he challenged gently. Taking a deep breath, Josephine began to speak. "I was married before, back east. His name was Thomas. He was kind, educated, everything I thought I wanted. We had a good life in Philadelphia. I taught at a ladies' academy. He practiced law." Anders remained silent, giving her space to continue. "3 years ago, there was a fire at our home. Thomas was trapped inside." Her voice threatened to break, but she forced herself to continue. "I tried to save him. I tried so hard, Anders." She held up her hands then, turning them to show him the palms. In the fading light, he could just make out the network of scars, burns that had long healed but left their permanent marks. "My hands are scarred," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The cowboy took them, his calloused fingers gentle as they traced the ridged skin. "They're beautiful because they're yours," he said with such conviction that Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't save him," she continued, "and afterward I couldn't bear to stay. The pity, the whispers, the daughter of Judge Reynolds, widowed so young, scarred so terribly. So I came west, where no one knew me or my history." Anders brought her hands to his lips, kissing each palm with a reverence that broke something loose inside her. "You're the bravest person I've ever known, Josephine Reynolds, and these scars," he traced them again. "They're proof of your courage, your love, your willingness to risk everything for someone who matters to you. How could that ever make me think less of you?" The tears she'd held back for so long finally spilled over. "I swore I wouldn't let myself care like that again. Wouldn't risk that kind of loss. And now," he asked, his blue eyes searching hers. "Now I'm terrified," she admitted, "because I care for you, Anders, more than I thought possible. And your job, the dangers you face daily," He silenced her with a kiss, gentle but insistent, his hands still holding hers between them. When he finally pulled back, his expression was serious. "I can't promise you a life without risk, Josephine. That would be a lie. But I can promise you won't face it alone. Not the good parts, not the bad parts, not ever again if you'll have me." She studied his face, the strength there, yes, but also the tenderness, the understanding. "I'm still afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he confessed. "Loving someone means having something precious to lose, but living without love," he shook his head. "That's no life at all." The truth of his words resonated within her. For 3 years, she'd been existing rather than living, protecting herself from pain by refusing to risk joy. "I want to try," she finally said. "With you, despite my fears or maybe because of them, because you make me brave enough to face them." His smile was like the sunrise, gradual and glorious. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance to build something together day by day." As the last light faded from the sky, they sat wrapped in each other's arms, watching stars appear one by one. Josephine's scarred hands were entwined with Anders's strong ones, the past and present meeting in a promise of future. Spring arrived in Broken Ridge with its usual explosion of wildflowers and renewed activity. The schoolhouse had a new addition, a small library funded by the town council at Sheriff Galloway's suggestion. And Josephine had a new addition as well. A gold band on her left hand, placed there by Anders in a simple ceremony attended by the entire community. Their home, a modest but comfortable house on the edge of town, became a gathering place for children seeking extra tutoring and adults looking for the sheriff's counsel. The scars on Josephine's hands never fully faded, but she no longer hid them. Instead, they became a reminder of her journey of loss overcome, of love found again in the most unexpected of places. On warm evenings, the sheriff and his schoolteacher wife could often be seen sitting on their porch, hands intertwined as they watched the sun set over the prairie. Two people who had found in each other not just companionship, but the courage to embrace life with all its joys and sorrows, its risks and rewards. "Any regrets?" Anders would sometimes ask her, tracing the scars on her palm. And Josephine would smile, remembering that sunset on the ridge when she'd finally found the courage to open her heart again. "Not a single one," she'd reply, leaning against the shoulder of the man who had shown her that even the most wounded hands could still reach for happiness and find it.